Hello, I'm Harry Brelsford, a small business server consultant, trainer, and author. I'm also a small business specialist and the CEO of SMB Nation out of the Seattle, Washington area. If you're watching this video today, it's likely that you're attending the worldwide HP Microsoft Workshop series that's focused on the Small Business Specialist program and Small Business Server. And I'm joined by my friend Greg Starks from HP.
Hello.
Greg, you're a small business specialist, but tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure, absolutely. As you mentioned, I'm from HP and been doing various engineering functions there over the years, back when it was Compaq and now HP. And most recently been doing solutions engineering, focusing on the small and medium market. Now that involves things like best practices for infrastructure, specific recommendations for hardware configs on servers for applications, Microsoft applications, and so on.
Well, what's great about getting together and putting together this video is you and I have had the chance to work at the annual SMB Nation conference where you've told your story, and you've also had conversations with attendees at some of the workshops, and we wanted to make sure we captured that. Yeah. And I'll be honest with you, I really benefit from your hardware knowledge. A lot of us in this industry came from the consulting side and perhaps the software side. And I think there's a real opportunity for you to educate us on the hardware and at the end of the day, tell the HP story. So Greg, let's start our talk today by focusing on the real world and talking about a small business IT infrastructure. And the way I want to approach this is highlight a great document from a solutions team back at Microsoft in Redmond, the Small IT Solution Accelerator. And before we get too deep into it, it's really interesting that this document speaks in terms of multiple servers in an SBS environment. And we'll revisit that topic a little bit later. But maybe you could walk me through this document.
Well, absolutely. This document is a very good resource of technical information for IT providers to small businesses because it provides templates, it provides some best practices for them to be able to set up a network in an efficient manner. And so let me just walk you through that a little bit. Well, the core of the network, of course, is the small business server itself. I mean, that's really the main server that provides all the infrastructure services in the network. The other servers that are shown here, we'll talk about a little bit later, but they basically provide additional or auxiliary functions on the network. As you see, of course, you have a central switch and then a firewall, and you'll notice that's an external firewall. The clients and printers are also connected on the network. So this is just a foundational, very basic diagram of a small business network.
Yeah, and I think it lends itself really well to discussion. I mean, we have sort of the obligatory printer function, some wireless access, very common in the small business, and different types of clients, and a scanner and backup and so on. So that, there's something really interesting here that kind of gets us into our next topic, and that is, if I look closely, the small business server machine appears to have a single network adapter card or a single NIC, and the network itself is supported by a hardware-based firewall. So what's really interesting is the other day I received an email from a reader, Ian Phillips of Shownet Systems in the UK, just outside London, who asked a very timely question about, with Small Business Server 2003 coming out with SP1, where the refresh in the ISA server family was from ISA 2000 to ISA 2004, Ian asked, is it still a best practice, or is there still relevancy in having a hardware-based firewall? And as you know from some of our events, we're a community where people use hardware-based firewalls, software-based firewalls, or a combination of the two. What are your feelings on Ian's question?
Well, ISA 2004 is certainly a more robust, easier to use, easier to configure product than the previous version. And as you mentioned, a lot of the events, many of the IT providers choose to make that their only firewall. And when they do that, they are basically setting up a 2-NIC scenario on their SBS server, one going to the internet and one going to their LAN.
Correct.
Right. Well, that is a perfectly valid approach. It does have a couple of limitations, however, in dealing with some remote management scenarios and really giving you the best ability to get in and interact with that network without having to make a site visit. So the way that would happen is you would put an external hardware firewall, either instead of ISA or in addition to ISA. And what you do with that is make sure you select one that has VPN capability so that you can get an IP address on an internal LAN, which will allow you to access not only the server but all the other devices on the network. Now, that's important to allow you to access a remote management card that may be installed in the server.
So let me stop you right there, because you must have read my mind. Ian actually had a second question in his email asking about what was the optimal or best practice way to configure a remote management card. So again, his questions are very timely. So what I'm starting to hear you say is that the hardware-based firewall gives you more flexibility in the remote management of the server. Tell me more about that.
That's right. Let's say ISA is your only firewall.
Okay.
All right. When the server is not functioning properly, either there was a hardware failure or the OS has crashed, is suffering some problem where it's not responsive.
Yeah.
Well, if that's your firewall, you have no way to get in because that server is providing the VPN connections. Well,
that is correct.
Right. So if you have an external firewall that has a VPN capability, when the user comes in from the internet, or the support provider, let's say, comes in from the internet, that hardware firewall can provide up an IP address and an authenticated connection. Now, it's important to make sure that the authentication doesn't in turn depend on Active Directory.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
At least for 1 or 2 administrative connections.
Okay.
When everything's all working well, by all means, you can have the SBS server be your primary VPN solution for the company. But for the administrative connections, make sure the hardware firewall can provide that. Because the server's down, it's not going to provide the Active Directory authentication. So if you have the hardware firewall providing that connection, authenticating locally with the username and password, at that point, they are on the network. And they can see the state of things. What they will observe, let's say, if that server is unresponsive or has crashed or there's a hardware failure, they'll see that the machine is unresponsive. Well, if they have the remote management card in place, they can go to that IP address and access that remote management functionality. So let me describe that a little bit. If you have a remote management capability, it allows you to get a separate connection from the OS. There's a chip in one case and a module in another case, depending on the server model, that serves up a small web interface to allow them to connect to that and giving them access to do things like power up the server. As a matter of fact, there's a demo. Why don't we just show the video of that we brought? And
I
rather than
agree.
me
I agree.
covering
Let's take a look
and we'll
at
come
that.
back and talk about it.
This is Scott Schaefer with HP, and today we're going to be taking a look at the ILO Advanced Pack and the functionality provided by your integrated Lights Out.
Logging in to the integrated Lights Out can be done using a dedicated username and password stored in the ILO, or it can be connected to your directory server. One of the most important features of the integrated Lights Out is the ability to have a complete graphical remote console of your managed server, allowing you to watch the server boot, for example. It gives you complete control over the system screen as if you were in front of the physical server. I could select to run the option ROB configurations for the array utility. I could boot into diagnostics. I have full control over this server as if I'm in front of it with a keyboard and a mouse and video remotely from anywhere in the world. While this system boots, let's take a look at some of the other functionality of the integrated Lights Out. One important capability is the ability to get to control of the power system. You can see here that I have the option of being able to do a momentary press. I can do complete press and hold, or I can do cold boot of the system, or just a reset. In addition to virtual power, I also have the ability to connect to the server via virtual media. This allows me to use the floppy or CD-ROM drive on my local system as if it were connected to the remote computer. I can connect directly to the floppy in my A drive or directly to my CD-ROM drive. In addition, I can connect to an image file, allowing me to boot the server to a particular floppy image without actually having to use floppies. The same can be done with virtual CDs. I can connect to ISO images and boot the server, and will boot directly to that CD-ROM image. In addition to the virtual media capability, I have access to virtual indicators that show me the status of the unit identifier light and a virtual serial port, which gives me access through terminals through a telnet interface, if I so chose, into the server. Let's go back to our remote console session, and we'll see the system has booted to the operating system. From here, I have complete control over it again, as if I were in front of the server. Notice, though, that in addition to the ability to get this graphical remote console through the hardware, if I'd like to increase the performance, I can connect to the server through terminal services. This will allow me to run the terminal services session through my integrated lights out NIC, which allows me to get to this server over my management network, utilizing my integrated lights out interface. And while you can do a lot of things with terminal services, and the performance is really good, there's some things you can't do. And so for that, you still have the ability to fall back on the complete graphical remote console offered through the integrated lights out.
So what you saw in the video there, the demo, was that they showed the remote console where they watched the server boot up in text mode. You also saw them do the virtual floppy where they connected the media to remotely access. And then also the graphical console.
So I think what that demo did for me, and hopefully some of the audience members, is to really help us understand what the ILO functionality is, the remote management card being supported by HP. Now, so Greg, as you know, small business specialists talking to small business specialists, we kind of have two skill sets. We have a technical or a technician skill set, and we have a business skill set as a consultant. Serving real-world customers. So maybe you can take the first couple of topics we covered, and in the context of Ian Phillips' questions, and kind of wrap it up in a business discussion. What's the bottom line?
Well, the best way to talk about that, I think the things we've covered so far, as they relate to remote management, as they relate to the lights out functionality, is really to help that IT provider to provide better support to the customer without having to make unplanned or unscheduled site visits. So let me just show you how that might play out.
Okay.
So on a server, you would have an event that would occur, let's say some sort of failure event or alert. Maybe this is a temperature alert,
Okay.
or a memory module has had a correctable error and the system's still running. Hard drive maybe has had a smart hard drive failure and is continuing to run.
Sure.
Well, on Windows Server, Small Business Server 2003, you would load on the HP agents and drivers, which would collect that information. Now, we have a product that comes with our 300 series products that is HP Systems Insight Manager.
Sure.
All right. If you have that installed, it is able to collect those events that came from the hardware through the drivers into this console. Now, then it can then send those events out to the IT provider, either by email or by page. And that point in time, if the ILO capability is there, if the remote access via the firewall is set up correctly, they can come in and do remote analysis. Now, if the server's not completely crashed, they can come in through the VPN, use terminal services, and have the rich environment to inspect what's going on. If the server has catastrophically failed, they can come in and use the ILO interface and reboot the server, interact with the BIOS, and so on, and still see what is happening in that customer's environment.
Well, and again, that ties back to having the hardware-based firewall and having the VPN connectivity and authentication at that level, because the server isn't working or able to provide it.
It may be the problem.
That may be the problem. You can come in and fix it. Very good.
One other thing I should point out is that in addition to making that analysis, a lot of times for a customer, you will have a scenario where there's a lag in the time that it takes for them to get a purchase order together to get replacement parts. And so if the IT provider happens to be, for this particular customer, one that buys and purchases parts, that can be done remotely. He knows this failure has occurred over the weekend. They can go ahead and order the parts and get them on the way. He calls the customer and tells them the parts are on the way. It improves the customer experience, improves the reputation of the provider.
Sure. Well, we all know about that. Better customer service as small business specialists. Well, one thing I want to key in on next that you started to discuss was the fault tolerance area and the failure area. So in the context of the fault tolerance area, there's, if I go back to early parts of my career, there were always kind of the main areas we like to monitor. We like to monitor the disk and the RAM memory and the processor and the power supply and so on. And